Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us this week. Now, on the front end, I'm just going to go ahead and let our listeners know that I'm a bit more on the edge of my seat listening to today's conversation than usual, because I first proposed this idea to you, Jim, a couple of years ago, and I have just been waiting ever since for you to finally take the bait. So at the expense of overselling this topic, I'll go ahead and tell you what we're going to talk about today, which is work. And specifically, I just want to delve into both the biblical and cultural perspectives on work, I will say with my intended effect of helping us to see work for more than what it is, but also less than what we tend to make it. That might not make sense at this point, but hopefully it will as we continue talking. Because it's no surprise that Americans have quite a mixed history when it comes to work, particularly a work-life balance. Just 10 years ago, I read that a Gallup poll found that full-time American workers reported working about 47 hours a week. And I feel like that was pretty much on trend with the relationship that Americans had with work at that time. You heard a lot about chronic workaholism, us choosing work over pleasure, all the unused PTO that we let lingering out there as we pursued our career goals, and so on. But a similar poll conducted last year reveals that now full-time American employees are clocking in for about 36.4 hours a week. So again, that's a full 10 hours less a week in a period of 10 years. I think COVID certainly has a lot to do with that. But Jim, what else is up with Americans working less?
Yeah, I mean, this has actually been studied a fair bit, and I keep track of this just as a vocational hazard because I supervise almost 100 people on staff, and so there are several reasons. One is the rise in part-time jobs, or people moving to part-time employment. That's become more popular, more lucrative. So not just something you have to, but for a lot of people, it's something they just want to. That's what they want. Another is the move, and this is very significant, is that we've moved from a products-based economy to more of a service-providing economy or service-based economy. In other words, we've moved from producing goods to providing services. And manufacturing isn't flexible, certainly not like a service-based economy is. I mean, it takes 10 hours, for example, or 30 hours to do a particular production. There's no way to cut that down, and it's not a flexible thing. And so when you move from manufacturing-based, products-based to service-based, you have more flexibility with hours. You can do sometimes more with less, and technology comes along and helps, and you can make all kinds of changes. Another reason is an intentional shorter work week, which a lot of employers are doing. You alluded to that. Result of either employees' desire for more flexibility, rising wages, which means that they can't have them work as many hours because they're having to pay more wages, job availability, talent shortages, all kinds of things. But just think about the flexibility factor, that alone. Gen Zers and millennials want a lot more flexibility and work-life balance than perhaps maybe the boomers did. Younger employees could be working less because of personal preference. It's just a desire. Options for remote or hybrid work arising from the pandemic have prompted a lot of demands, particularly among younger generations, for alternative working conditions and hours. Lack of, so that's huge. I was having dinner the other night with a couple that were my age. They were saying how their children said, "We just don't want to work like you did. we just don't want to do that. We don't want to put in those kinds of hours. Not laziness, just we want more of a balance that's intentional." And a lack of childcare and elder care options has also forced a lot of people into a shorter work week usually women, for various reasons, but just to reduce their hours. It forces them to reduce their hours or sometimes to leave the workforce altogether. So a lot of different factors going into this.
Now, I floated an article to you recently from The Atlantic that pushed for a shorter work week. And I've read quite a bit recently in favor of what you mentioned, that 4-day work week as opposed to a 5-day work week. And the conclusion is based on research that shows that longer work weeks don't necessarily result in more productivity, but in some cases, actually less productivity. As employees struggle to maintain the necessary level of mental health to complete good work. I get all of that for sure. But something that I keep coming back to every time I read those arguments or read those articles is just the fundamental purpose of work. I mean, after all, work was God's idea. And there are hints in the Bible, I would say, that we're going to be working in heaven. Probably not the same exact kind of jobs, but there will be something that we'll be doing in heaven. So perhaps working less isn't always the solution. Will you riff on that a bit?
Well, first, it's really interesting. I would ask our listeners, when was the last time they heard a sermon series on work? On just the marketplace, and I bet you they haven't, maybe ever. I remember the first series I ever did on it was, the church was only about a year and a half, 2 years old, and I remember it. It was dating myself. Took a clip off of Bachman Turner Overdrive song, and we called it "Taking Care of Business," and we did like a 5-week thing on it. So I do think there's a kind of a desert here in terms of people knowing how to think Christianly about it, because I don't think it's taught on very often. So what I think you're asking for, and I'll take the bait, is a theology of work.
Yeah.
Just to kind of, and it doesn't have to be super lengthy, because the heart of a theology of work is actually fairly simple. It all rests in this incredibly rich, deep word, vocation. And vocation comes from a Latin word, vocatio, which meant summons or invitation. The idea is that our work is to be infused with a clear and direct sense of honor and worth, as if the task itself was God's summons, God's call in our life. It was an offering that we were making unto God. The idea of calling, vocation, is that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are and everything we do and everything that we have is invested with a special devotion to him, as if we're living our life as a response to his summons, as a response to his service. Which is why, and like when you read the great devotional writers, like someone like Brother Lawrence, who was a cook in a 17th century monastery, he once wrote, as a cook, which was his job, he said, "I turn my omelet over in the pan out of love for God." That was how much it infused his thinking as a cook. Perhaps the most overlooked contribution to the modern world of the 16th century Reformation. I say overlooked. It's not overlooked by sociologists, certainly, and not by historians, but the average person. We tend to think of a lot of things that the Reformation gave, but but one of the big contributions societally, culturally, was how it really vigorously pursued the recovery of this idea, arguing that all of secular life should be made into a vocation of God. Owen Chadwick once wrote that it was kind of like a baptism of the secular world. Calling, in other words, wasn't just for the priest. Calling wasn't just for the monk. Serving God through the church was no higher in the moral scale than the calling of a shoemaker or, anyone. Once a Christian, your vocational place in life takes on new meaning. And no one's place in life is less of an offering to God than another. Whatever you do should be offered as worship of and to the living God. Every role has intrinsic value. I mean, it is to be viewed as a gift submitted in devotion. This is much of what the idea of the priesthood of the believer, that great theological idea, is about. Every kind of work can be and should be a sacred calling. Now, this is new thinking for many people. It's a revolutionary expansion of most Christians' thinking about the nature of their lives. Because our tendency is to compartmentalize. And with our spiritual life over here and our vocational life over there, or our job over there, And we struggle with how to live for Christ in the marketplace in terms of survival, and we sometimes with ethics, but in terms of seeing the job itself as a sacred act of worship is often beyond our spiritual vision. Henry Nouwen comes to mind. He's done some really interesting reflections on vocation, I think, among many other things. He says we tend to focus on learning how to fold our hands in prayer, but we forget to learn how to make the work of our hands into a prayer. I thought that was extremely well put. But this is precisely what the idea of vocation challenges us to pursue. The idea behind calling is that whatever our occupation may be, is to be elevated to an expression of worship as that which would be pleasing to God, if performed with excellence and integrity and heartfelt devotion. So a real estate agent is to represent her clients for the greater glory of God as a committed servant. A software developer's labor is to be infused with a sense of piety. But this is really, 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 really rare. Dorothy Sayers, who is one of the inklings that nobody knows about, she was a little late to that game, but she was a fantastic mystery writer. I wish more people would get into her work. But she once wrote that we live in a world where doctors practice medicine not primarily to relieve suffering, but to make a living. Lawyers accept briefs, not because they have a passion for justice, but because the law is the profession that enables them to live. It's as if we've reduced being a Christian doctor or a Christian lawyer to what is done outside of the office hours, what they do with their spare time and in some kind of official ministry or volunteer position at a church or something. The fallacy of this, and Sayers teases this out, is that we view work not as the expression of our creative energy in the service of society, but only something we do in order to obtain money and leisure, the leisure time that it provides. So, and that obviously would be a very poor theology of work as opposed to the vision of vocation and work as worship. So yeah, work matters.
Yeah. Well, and I feel like, some people in response to the heavy-handedness that we can put on the productivity aspect of work might say in response, well, work should really be about your personal fulfillment. Or, they might use that same terminology of your vocational calling, that you should pursue a job that makes you happy and that allows for you to fully chase your passions and your desires. Again, I mean, I feel like between the two of us, if you've been listening to this podcast, you know that I am the critic, I guess, or the one who always thinks negatively about things. But
or cynic.
The cynic. That's where I was trying to go. But again, I feel like that rhetoric is certainly pleasing for sure. But the truth is that most of the world does not have the luxury of choosing their dream job. And even if you do have the luxury of choosing your dream job, you can fall prey to just continual job hopping, hoping to find that perfect job, over the rainbow somewhere. So what does, again, a Christian worldview have to offer in this area? Because again, this is more of a modern phenomenon. You're talking about kind of the history of work. People didn't have the luxury of choosing, for the most part, what job they were going to go into. They were apprenticed or it was handed to them. So this is kind of a newer-ish struggle.
Yeah, it is. We view our jobs now as something that should, and first and foremost, fulfill us. Mm-hmm. And not fulfill us as worshipers, which we were talking about, fulfill us as in a very individualistic, privatized way. Our work should be about us. But again, the primary sense of calling is that it is not for self at all. It's for God's glory. It's about taking the place we were when we came to Christ, whatever that place was, whatever our situation was, and infusing it with new meaning because we came to Christ. If we're stirred to make a career adjustment, then who God made us to be, including gifts and passions and personality type, along with whatever leadings he provides, obviously can and should come into play. There's nothing wrong with that. But the higher goal remains doing whatever we do with a sense of purpose and meaning, worship and offering. The job doesn't bring that to us. That's what we are to bring to the job. That's what, in Colossians, Paul talks about how we should work willingly at whatever you do as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Independent of any individual calling toward a specific area of life investment, there's a primary calling to faithfulness to God himself. Determining whether I am called to be an economist or if I choose to continue to be an economist, that's secondary to the task at hand. If I currently am an economist, that's how I'm functioning in terms of my work. I'm called to be a Christian who engages his work as an economist as an act of worship. That's first and foremost. So vocation is as much about being faithful where we find ourselves as much as it is finding where we are to be faithful. When it comes to our jobs, this doesn't mean that we're to just automatically just stay glued to wherever we are. We have no choice in the matter. No. But what must be guarded against, which you alluded to, is an ongoing continual restlessness. And I've seen this in so many people's lives. We can just spend our entire lives trying to find our place, only to wake up one day and realize that our lives have been used up entirely in the search. And we never infused where we did work with any sense of calling. I've seen this in the lives of so many people, and particularly, I could probably reflect on it and have some ideas, but why? But particularly with men, it's like they have no idea what they want to do when they grow up. And I've walked away from so many conversations with young men and older men too. But it's like, I'm thinking to myself, they have no idea, no clue, what they want to do when they grow up, and they may be in their 30s or 40s or even 50s. They have one, and as a result, they have 1 foot in and 1 foot out wherever they are, wherever they're working. They are never fully invested. Wherever they are, they kind of treat it like a rented apartment, never a home they have bought. They can work somewhere for a year and come home at the end of every day, or 2 or 3 years every day, and come home every day wondering, gosh, I wonder what I might want to do one day. I wonder where I might want to live. I just wonder. And that year becomes a decade, and that decade becomes a lifetime, and they wasted the opportunity they had to make where they were a calling. I actually did. It's interesting. One of the reasons why this is such a big deal with so many conversations I've had, primarily with men over decades, I remember and how we're so driven to make it all about us and all about personal fulfillment. I did a personal study, a Bible study on this several years ago. It was eye-opening for me because I really went at the scriptures over this particular issue. Did you know there's not a single case in all of Scripture, unless I just missed it, but not a single case in all of Scripture where someone went on a journey of self-discovery in order to find and follow God's vocational call in their life? I couldn't find it. There isn't a single case in Scripture where someone went on a vocational hunt for their occupational niche in light of their personality, gifting, and experience. You see, we've bought into this self-absorbed thinking that begins and ends with our personal makeup and what it would take to make us feel fulfilled and satisfied and happy and whole. And everything about our job is wonderful, and we love it all, and on it goes. And so in other words, we're looking for work that's not work in some ways. And we've let that become a license for the wholesale pursuit of that kind of fantasy almost. But if you look at the Bible, here's what you'll find. You'll find times when people were invited to do something, selected to do something, presented with the opportunity to do something, but not once will you find someone say, this is what would satisfy me or make me happy or allow me to be healthy and whole. And then they map out a strategy to make it happen through a series of vocational stops and starts. I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just saying that what you find in the Bible are people who simply lived their life in faithfulness and responded to what God brought their way. But in the meantime, wherever they were, whatever they were doing, they placed their gifts and abilities, investments, and labor before him in submission. And even if God never brought anything different their way, they embraced their place in life with the belief that at the very least, where they were currently had been brought their way. I mean, I'm where I am right now for a reason. Again, our fundamental calling is not about what we do as much as how we do it. It isn't about where we go as much as what we do where we are. If God leads beyond that, so be it, but that's not the foremost issue at hand. You know, I've often said, did you ever think that maybe, just maybe, you're to stop looking, stop dreaming about wherever it is you think you might prefer to be, and realize you already are somewhere God has placed you and that he wants you there. And whether that's the reality for you or not, what is 100% certain is that where you are right now, for however long it might be, what God most absolutely, definitely wants you to do is to offer your work there as worship to him. We look for where we want to be or would like to be, dream of being, forgetting that we're already in a situation that God has placed us in order that we might infuse it with meaning and significance. This enables us to live for Christ now, in the moment, rather than waiting for a season or a set of circumstances that we imagine might afford us the ability to live for Christ somehow later. Somehow later, I'll make work worship. But I got to wait for that job that's perfect. And that's not at all. You just won't find that anywhere in Scripture. It said we can spend our lives trying to find our place, only to wake up one day and realize our lives have been used up entirely in that search. And we missed our moment. We missed it. And then sadly, we realized that we were where God had placed us all along, and we didn't answer the true, deepest call of that situation. So our primary determination is to look for satisfaction in our work and to discover how to bring honor to God through it. Calling, as a result, is as much about how someone is living and for what purpose, as much as what someone is actually doing in terms of occupation. Or here's another Nouwen insight. Nouwen twice in one podcast, and I don't think I've mentioned him yet, but he is one of my favorite authors. But Nouwen said it's really about knowing here and now is what counts as most important, because it is God himself who wants me at this time in this place. Or Douglas Steere, a Quaker, this is just kind of coming to mind, wrote about being present where you are and the power of being present where you are. One thing I'd throw out about your question, I know I'm really riffing on this, but that's how some people, and again, I've seen this mostly with men, will use trying to find this perfect, form-fitting, fulfilling job as an excuse to not do what it takes to provide for their family. They're waiting for that perfect, fulfilling job while the bills pile up and the creditors start to call, and they should go out and be doing anything and everything they can. I've seen this played out so many times. I can almost tell it to you, because I've seen it play out so many times, as the tale of two men, like the first guy is a guy who works hard and faithfully at his job. He does it week after week, month after month, year after year. He does everything he can to keep that gainful employment with integrity and a great work ethic. He infuses it with a sense of worship. He's on it. But the economy takes a turn. The company goes south, maybe just some downsizing. He gets laid off. What changes with that man and his sense of responsibility? Nothing. Nothing changes. He immediately goes into providing mode. He humbles himself and does whatever he can. He cuts lawns. He washes windows. He paints houses. He picks up any part-time job, any extra income he can. And there's nothing wrong with those things. It's just that he's just piecing together 5 hours here, 10 hours there, whatever he can get. I mean, if he could get full time in any of those, he'd jump all over it and be grateful for it and praise God. But the whole time he's pushing his resume, he's going to interviews while he's doing that, everything he can to get back into full time employment. But in the meantime, he isn't about to squander even a single day where he could do something to provide. And because of that mentality, that kind of work ethic, that kind of commitment, it isn't long before he is right back into gainful employment and providing for his family. Now, here's the tale of the second guy. Okay, he loses his job or quits. A lot of quitting in this particular person's portfolio. He's quit a lot of jobs because he's never seemed to find the one he likes or one that doesn't make him do things he doesn't want to do, or he has a problem with authority, or there's always some real or imagined, ethical issue that he just can't go along with. And so he quits and quits and quits. He eventually ends up sitting at home, playing games online for hours on end, having 1,000 excuses as to why he's not employed, 1,000 excuses why he's not even trying, all the while happily seeing his wife troop off to work, her fingers to the bone, indifferent to the family suffering financially. You know how many times I've seen this scenario? Just so many times. So it's not just about fulfillment. This is also about, responsibility.
I just want to make 2 points, just respond in 2 ways, just because I don't want anybody to misinterpret anything that you said. Because I've heard you talk about this enough that I know, certainly there are reasons why you wouldn't stay in a job. Certainly. I mean, you when you were talking about the two guys and you said real or imagined problems, that's we're going to bracket off that guy for a second. Yes, there are some legitimate excuses why you may need to leave a job or things may have changed, in which case those aren't usually the cases, but just I don't want to anything that you said about sticking firm into a job cause for kind of poor theology for people who probably do have felt a sense that I really do need to leave. God is calling me elsewhere.
Right. I totally agree with that. That's a good point. The thing to be cautious about is when this is the 5th time it's happened in 8 years.
Yes. Well, I love what you said about is it Latin word for vocation, meaning invitation, that prayer should be involved in the whole process. You should feel invited to something else, not just a solution to, as you put it, restlessness of there's just something else out there maybe that I need to find. But then also I love that I think you use the analogy of renting, of we can get into this idea of this rental mentality with work and never put roots down. And I think sometimes people don't realize that they can do both. You can put roots down in a place and still be praying of, I'm just open, God, if you want to lead me somewhere else. But until that happens, I'm just going to be 100% where I am. But it's not like those two are mutually exclusive. You can do both of those things and still in a very God-honoring way. I don't feel like you have to completely close yourself
I
off.
totally agree. And my footnote to your footnote is there is a difference between being open to where God might lead and almost making that your daily prayer. God, I really will go wherever you want me to go. I mean, I'm ready to leave this job anytime you want me to, because that creates a restlessness.
Yeah, you're right.
That creates where you don't put down roots. I feel like, if you feel God genuinely called you someplace, okay, you're there until He actually calls you out of it. And that's not where you're saying, okay, God, I'm ready for you to make that call. it's you just okay. My mentality is I'm here. I'm here. I'm not. And that does change how you view the job. It changes how you invest in it. It changes about the degree to which you'll work through challenges and difficulties and all kinds of. It changes so many things, and with any aspect of calling So.
Yeah, great point. Well, there's the work that we do, but then, there's another layer to this conversation when we think about how just our jobs take up so much of our day and our lives. Often the people that we interact with our coworkers, oftentimes more than even our families, even nowadays, if that's in virtual spaces. So while the jobs that we perform are important, could the people that we work with also be connected to this kind of spiritual nature of work? In other words, might we benefit once again from a Christian perspective here in terms of how we view our coworkers?
This is such an important question, and it brings to mind so many important things to talk about. For example, how how increasing numbers of workers, particularly younger ones, are looking for their jobs to fulfill every single aspect of purpose and meaning for their lives. They want their job to embody their personal commitment to everything from social justice to their political agendas. They want everything about their job to embody who they are and to do what they would do and to stand for what they would stand for and to be a way for them to express everything they want to try to accomplish and be and do in life. It's as if the job now has to be their family, it has to be their church, it has to be their neighborhood, it has to be their political action committee, it has to be their source for mental health, it has to be their source for physical health. I mean, it's like people are putting all this weight on their job, their employer, that has never been put on that before in the history of labordom. In a day when there is just this deep sense of the loss of community. I mean, I get what's behind it. We live in a day where there's a loss of community, there's a decline in church involvement. People are more transient than ever in terms of where they live, which erodes roots and commitment to either community or neighborhood. People are increasingly looking for their jobs to fulfill all of those social, emotional, spiritual needs. The marketplace just isn't set up for that. I mean, I see a lot of companies scrambling to try to do it, but they're just not set up for that, and nor should it be. Our jobs are not meant to be our world. They're not meant to be our church. They're not meant to be our family. They're not meant to be our political action committee. And so what you find is that there was like this rush for some jobs to try to do that, but now there's a pull back. Like Harvard just announced, we are no longer going to speak out on social political issues. That's just not our job. We're an educational institution. We're not going to be making these public stances as an institution on these political matters. We're going to focus on teaching humanities. And so they've had to pull back because they were just being forced to speak out on every single news cycle. But let's turn to your question. How to view the people we work with, how do we interact with them, how to view them. And I've got a lot I really would love to explore there, but normally you're the one that keeps us on time, but I'm sensing we're running out of time.
Yeah.
So maybe we should we've never done a two-parter before, have we?
No, but if there's any topic that I'm here for, it's this one. I've been waiting for 2 years. We'll drag this out as long as you want.
Let me shut up. And
okay.
let's go back into this question and your other questions that you might have, and let's make this one a two-parter because I mean you're right. This is where we live. We live with our jobs, we live with our work, and these are important conversations in terms of the interplay of our faith and culture.
Awesome. Okay, well we'll leave it here for now then, and for those of you who are listening, you'll just hear part 2 of this next week. So hopefully you'll join us again for that.